Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavani Paschatya Shataya Vanchakhavatruvyascha Vipasindhuya Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Anta Radhakanta Namaste Takta Kanchana Gora discussion of Lord Rama and Rama Lila. Tomorrow is Rama Navami, otherwise known as Ram Navami, the 9th day of the, I don't know, is it waxing moon or waning moon? Waxing? Increasing moon?
Yeah.
Increasing? Okay. And we discussed yesterday about Shurpanaka, and then at the end we began to discuss about another key moment in pastimes of Ram, according to the sage Valmiki, namely the chasing of the magical deer, the jewel-studded deer, who of course was the disguised form, the magical form of Maricha, who is one of the associates of Ravana, the Rakshasas. Rakshasas are said to be man-eating beasts. They seem to have no hesitation to have human beings as their meals. And they are shape-shifters. They can change shapes. Would you like to be able to change your shape sometimes? Yes? If you could change your shape, what would you be? What would you change your shape to? Huh?
Something that can fly,
Something that can fly.
for example.
Okay. So you could just walk outside and fly across Ljubljana instead of having to be in all the traffic. Anyone else have an idea of what you would like to be? No? Nobody has idea what you would want to be? Huh? A millionaire. Well, that's not changing shape. That's just having a lot of money. Huh?
Millionaire without beard.
The shape of the wallet. Fat wallet. I see. Then that would solve all your problems, right?
Maybe changing a gender.
Changing gender. Oh. Some people, of course, actually do that, right? Nowadays, people actually do that. Which is, to me, quite an amazing thing. I don't quite comprehend that people do that. Changing gender. A lot of, we mentioned plastic surgery. A lot of people nowadays, this is apparently quite popular. Changing the shape of your face. I heard in China there's a lot of that because there's a lot of social pressure for young people to look a certain way. So if you really want to be a shape shifter, be careful, because you might find yourself being born as a Rakshasa. That's what Maricha found himself to be, and as a result he had to do a certain service for Ravana, which he absolutely did not want to do, because he knew he knew exactly what's going to happen. We mentioned about that, we read a little bit what Maricha had to say to Ravana when Ravana explained his plan for Maricha. Maricha spoke very strongly to Ravana, telling him what a fool he was, what a mistake this was. Did Ravana listen? He didn't listen. Didn't listen to good advice. When Sita saw this beautiful deer, she became very attracted, and so much so, she urged Rama to go and to either capture the deer as a pet or to kill the deer, because she thought the skin of the deer, the hide, we call it in English, hide, H-I-D-E, same word as to hide. The hide of the deer would be wonderful to have to sit on. And initially what happens, Lakshmana says, this is not a good idea. Why? Because he immediately understood what's going on. He said, this must be Maricha. I mean, that deer is no ordinary deer. There's no question of it being just some fluke of nature, some strange beauty of nature. No, there's got to be some trouble there. That beauty looks like trouble, which is for us also a general good principle to keep in mind when we see anything especially attractive in the material world, attractive for our senses. What should we think?
Double trouble.
Double trouble. Yes, double trouble. It's a trap, right? The deer was a trap. But Sita prevailed in her arguments. Somehow Rama felt he wants to please Sita. And so he went after the deer. We're going to see more of this pattern. There's a certain pattern here, I would say, in the Ramayana. We have someone persuading someone else to do something, or in some cases we have someone trying to persuade someone else to do something but not succeeding. Can we think of any examples other than what I just mentioned in the Ramayana of someone persuading or not persuading? Maricha failed to persuade Ravana to not do what he wanted to do. What else? What other examples do we have? Can you think of something happening when, let's see, in the early days of Rama's life, when he is a teenager, a young man at home, something happens, someone comes to visit. You must be knowing the Ramayana story.
Some
the
sage
basic.
came. Some sage?
Yes, one sage. Do we know who the sage was?
I just know that he tried to persuade king to give him Ram to... Is that the case?
Yes, that's it. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, the sage was Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra, he's kind of the sage in many stories. And what does he want to persuade? He wants to persuade Dasharatha to allow
Ram to help him.
Rama to help him. Also Lakshman, yeah. What's Dasharatha's first reaction? No. Forget it. Rama is just a young boy, he's only 16 years old, he's very delicate, he's never been out in the wild before, he's not fit for what you want, he's not going to manage what you want. What does Vishwamitra want? He wants the two boys to help him to destroy Rakshasas who are harassing him when he's performing sacrifices in the forest. And so, first Dasharatha says, no, niet. And then Vishwamitra starts to get angry. Says, what are you doing saying no? I am a sage, Brahmana, coming to ask you. You have offered to please me with something and now you're saying no. This could be trouble. Sages are very sagely, but if you make them upset, watch out. They could turn their blessings into a curse. And so Dasharatha kind of says, okay. Yeah. So his persuasion, Vishwamitra's persuasion, is kind of connected to a threat. If you don't do what I want, I might curse you. Yeah, that was sort of how it went. What's another persuasion that goes on? Famous one. Yes. Yeah, Mantara. Mantara is the servant, the maid servant of Kaikeyi, and of course it's Mantara who she plants the idea in Kaikeyi to do what she eventually does. Before Mantara brought this idea that let Bharata be the king, let Rama be banished to the forest, she didn't even think of this, because there was kind of no question Rama would be the king. But then Mantara said, you could be the mother of the king, and all of this is very easily possible because you have two boons, two benedictions, which you can redeem. So in this case, Kaikeyi is rather quickly convinced, although initially she was very resistant. She couldn't bear the thought. But within a short time, Manthara managed to enter into her heart and change it. And that's, of course, when all the trouble starts. Okay, let's see. Other persuasions. I'm sure there are many more in the early days. Yes, yes, that's a very good one. Yes, we talked about this briefly, that when the news came to Rama that he would have to go to the forest for 14 years, he prepared to go alone. And then Sita said, "No, I'm going with you." And Rama said, "No." But then her argument became stronger. She became quite strong. She even said to Ram, "What kind of man are you if you don't take your wife with you?" And she had a quite strong argument that the wife must always be with the husband. That's like, I don't know, Dharma Shastra. Okay, so I thought we could read some of the deer pastime, some more of the deer pastime. Let's see, now, where are we? Okay. So I'm reading from, still, this is Aranya Kanda. Aranya means forest. And this is Sarga, or chapter 41. So this is when Rama is agreeing, yes, okay, I'm going to go and chase this deer. But in his determination, his declaration, what he's going to do, he says several times that he will kill the deer. He doesn't talk so much about capturing, but rather killing the deer. He says, this is verse 23, 23, "Just see how Vaidehi, Sita, longs to have this deer, Lakshmana. Because of his surpassing beauty, he shall die today." And he says there's no such deer anywhere to be found. And the lovely patterns on the deer's pelt, that means his skin, anyway, it just describes more his beauty. And he says, "Both for meat and sport, Lakshmana, kings armed with bows go hunting and kill animals in the deep forest. In the deep forests they gather riches with determination, precious metals of all sorts, veined with gems and gold. But here is all the wealth a man could ask for, Lakshmana. Riches enough to swell his coffers," that means to fill up his treasure chest. Just as Shukra's coffers, his treasure chest, come to be swelled, to be filled up with all the wealth men dream of. Those who know the theory behind material success and those who achieve it, Lakshman, say a man in want of something should go and get it without hesitation. So it seems like Rama is now persuading himself why he should do this. If he had any doubts, now he's going to make sure he himself is convinced, yes, I'm going. And he says, there is no hide, no animal skin, I would think, either antelopes or gazelles or goats or ewes, that could be so soft to the touch. So again, he's thinking about killing the animal. And he goes on praising this deer. And he says, then again, if it turns out to be the magic of that Rakshasa, because Lakshmana is saying this is a Rakshasa, Rama says, if it's a Rakshasa, fine. Then it is my duty to slay him, to kill him. For the savage, impious Maricha used to roam the forests, injuring the bulls among sages. Bull among sages, that means the big sages, the great sages. And then he tells a rather strange story, I won't go into that, about some demon and how some demon used to kill sages by taking the form of the sage's food, and then when they would eat the food, he would go in their stomach, and then he would destroy them from inside. So he's saying, just as happened with Vatapi, who was eventually outwitted, he was killed. No Rakshasa can hope to live that treats with scorn someone like me, who is constant in righteousness and self-control. But, he says, you must remain here to protect my Tili, armed and on your guard, for our first responsibility is to her. That's interesting. Here he's saying the first responsibility is to protect Sita. But later, at the end of the Ramayana, it seems like he doesn't feel quite like that anymore. But rather, he's thinking his first responsibility is to the kingdom. Of course, you can also say it's not that he's giving up all responsibility. He sends her to the forest, but she is sent to the ashram of Valmiki, which means she'll be protected. She'll be protected. So it's not that she's just being thrown out. And curiously enough, he says at the end of this speech, he says, okay, Lakshman, you have to stay here, you have to protect Sita, Mantili. And he says, with the aid of wise Jatayus, we usually say Jatayu, but the name is actually Jatayus, Jatayu. The capable and all-powerful bird, take care of my Tili. Be on your guard every moment, Lakshmana, and suspicious of everything. So, this is the duty for Lakshman. He's been given his task. As we know, what's going to happen? Lakshmana is going to become persuaded by Sita to leave, to go to protect Rama. Of course, he does this not because he's actually persuaded. It's not that he's actually persuaded that he should leave. In fact, he's quite persuaded otherwise. He knows that Rama is not in danger. But Sita has attacked him with a terrible, terrible accusation. Horrible accusation. Actually, I just read it earlier today. It's more shocking than I thought it was. She really is. She's heavy. Incidentally, there's a modern version of the Ramayana that's been done by some Indian gentleman named Ashok Banker. I think he lives in Mumbai. He's published his version. And I was curious, so I got a copy. It's actually kind of seems to be somewhat popular. I first saw it in a airport bookstore, I think. And I read his introduction, and he explains that he had read all the different versions of the Ramayana that you could possibly read, at least in some sort of readable language. So he said, I've read them all, I'm familiar with them. Now this is my version. And it's a very fascinating, he's written in a very fascinating way, I have to say. But what I wanted to say was that in his version, Sita she's a Kshatriya, and she is super powerful herself. She is super expert at fighting in hand-to-hand combat. She's like, like you see some of these comics. Yeah, she's kind of like that. So we usually think of Sita, oh, she's so delicate and so, helpless, right? But this author, he presents her in a very different way, which in some respects actually fits to the Valmiki Ramayana. As I said, sometimes she'll speak in a quite heavy way, like when she says to Rama, if you don't take me to the forest, what kind of man are you? So she can be like that. And when she speaks to Lakshman also, it's quite shocking. Okay, so Rama is on his way. He has 2 quivers of arrows with him on the back for fast shooting, maybe for shooting left-handed, right-handed, ambidextrous. Arjuna is like that. Arjuna is called Savyasachi, which means who can fight left-handed. He's ambidextrous, he can use either hand. So he's got lots of arrows with him. And the deer, being Maricha, he's quite, he wants exactly this to happen. So he's drawing Rama out into the forest further and further and further and further away. And he'll let Rama come close, and then whoop, he'll jump further away, he'll hide, and then he'll come out. Rama will follow. So this is going on. But then Maricha starts to get tired. So he goes to some shady spot, and then Rama sees the deer. Rama is determined to kill him, it says. So he prepares his bow and he draws it back. Aiming at the deer, he shot a gleaming, flaming arrow fashioned by Brahma that glared like a snake as it darted forth. The supreme arrow penetrated the illusory deer form, and like a lightning, and like a bolt of lightning, pierced the heart, Maricha's heart. The deer leaped high as a palm tree, and with a ghastly shriek fell to the ground, tormented by that arrow, his life ebbing away, his life going away. And as Maricha lay there dying, the shape he had assumed began to disappear. That beautiful, magical shape is now disappearing. Knowing the time had come, in Raghava's own voice he cried out, "O Sita! O Lakshmana!" So, apparently, such wizards, Rakshasas, not only have shape-shifting power, but also they can change their voice. This has nothing to do with it. There was a film. You've heard of Alfred Hitchcock?
Yes.
He made it was a film, I think. Maybe it was, yeah, I think it was a film. I think it was called The Ventriloquist. You know what a ventriloquist is? You know?
With the stomach, with puppets.
Yeah, he can speak in such a way that you think the sound is coming from the puppet. So this story about a ventriloquist where this puppet actually kind of takes on a life of its own, and eventually the puppet, I think he murders his master. Anyway, it's quite fun. Horror is one of the rasas, you know. It's one of the minor rasas. Horror. Why do we like horror movies? Because there's something relishable there. Okay. So then Maricha, as he's dying, he takes on his original form as a huge Rakshasa. And at that moment he dies. He dies, but then it describes him more. He's got huge fangs, has a golden necklace, sparkling earrings, all kinds of ornaments. And then Rama, he sees this huge Rakshasa lying on the ground, and he remembers Sita, and he remembers what Lakshmana was saying. And he realizes now is going to be a problem. Why? Because he called out in his own voice, "O Sita, O Lakshmana." So how is Sita going to react to this? And great armed Lakshmana, what will be his state of mind? And when he's thinking this, the hair on his body bristled with dread. Then Rama's consternation gave way to a feeling of fear that shot through him with sharp pangs. The deer he had slain was in fact a Rakshasa. The voice it had used was his own. So this is one thing interesting here as we start to see the emotions of Rama. Rama is a human being. He is, yes, he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but the whole idea is he is the Lord in the form of a human being, and as a human being he has human emotions. So now we're seeing this, it starts to come. The trouble, of course, is beginning, and we're going to see more of his anxiety, and then his lamentation, his anguish at separation from Sita, and of course his anger. We see a lot of Rama's anger in the Ramayana. He's already been very angry at, who was he angry at?
Oh,
Huh? Huh? Yeah, Shurpanaka. He was angry at her, and then he became angry at all the Rakshasas that Shurpanaka sent. First 14, and then 14,000. He gets, in a rage, and he kills them all. So anger, there's a lot of anger there. It's of course righteous anger. It's not ordinary anger. The last verse of this chapter, 42, is rather surprising. It says after he has killed Maricha, so he's killed a deer, which is actually this Rakshasa. And then the last verse says, he killed another dappled deer, and taking the meat, hurriedly retraced his steps to Janasthana. Huh? What's this about? Well, there's some discussion about this in the notes. And here's what the translator, Sheldon Pollock, says: why does Rama slay another deer? The commentators, remember I explained, he's looking at what the traditional Vaishnava commentators say. I believe they're Sri Vaishnavas. The commentators are puzzled also, and none offers a convincing explanation. One of them, he gives names in abbreviated form, so I'd have to look what are the names. One of them argues that, quote, another, unquote, here really connotes unusual, the unique deer. In other words, this deer which he killed, that is Maricha. But that doesn't make sense, because Rama would hardly have taken the Rakshas's meat. And another commentator maintains that the poet, namely Valmiki, has Rama slay another deer only in order to occasion sufficient delay for the events of the following sarga to happen. In other words, there has to be some time so that Ravana can abduct Sita. So he arranges, okay, the poet has Rama do this. This would give explanation of why there's a time gap. But this would not be necessary because, or shouldn't be necessary because Rama was in fact drawn by Maricha far away. Remember, he had taken him far away. Another Acharya, Venkatanatha Acharya, supposes him, namely Rama, simply to be bringing home dinner, something that Lakshman, now otherwise employed, would normally have done. This was clearly the understanding of one of the versions of the Ramayana, which says he killed other deer for their meat. And in a later chapter, Sita informs Ravana that her husband will soon come, quote, bringing an abundance of food from the forest. And that's explained elsewhere as the flesh of black deer, buffalo, and wild boar. The indecision among the manuscripts reflected in the critical text here as elsewhere may result from the discomfort later felt by the commentators regarding Rama's meat eating. So this is interesting because there are several passages in the Ramayana. The Valmiki Ramayana seems to say quite clearly that Rama and Lakshmana were sometimes killing animals for food. So some devotees are rather shocked at that. But one way of understanding this, there's different ways. One is you could say, well, that must all be interpolation. You know what interpolation? Interpolation means someone adds something later. Or we can say, no, this is Valmiki, and this is how he understands. And he understands this way. Why? Because this is what Kshatriyas do. And Kshatriyas can't be expected to be living just on fruits and roots. Although sometimes he says, also, I am now going to the forest to live with the sages, eating fruits and roots. So it's a little bit complicated. Anyway, I thought I will mention this because probably the versions of the Ramayana that you have read, quite possibly the versions that you have read, the summaries of the Ramayana, will exclude such references. Because we want to have a Rama who is vegetarian. So this was just to let you know, because someone may say, how is it Rama is described in the Ramayana that he eats meat? And you might go, no. Well, he is described as that, at least in some versions. So just so you're aware. Okay. Okay, it's already 8 o'clock. Maybe we stop there since tomorrow is a big day. If there's some comment or question, we could discuss briefly. Yes?
His anywhere described what was Maricha's destination.
His destination.
Yeah, because it's...
Yeah, he's killed by by the Lord, so presumably its destination is quite good.
He also called Sita's name and Lakshman's.
Yes, so all glories to Maricha. It's not mentioned here, that might be mentioned elsewhere. There are a lot of things which are kind of embellished in other works. There's a version of the Ramayana within the Mahabharata called the Rama Upakhyana, the story of Rama. There's also a Buddhist version. There's also, in various Puranas, there's different aspects. We talked about Kurma Purana, that story is there. So something maybe in other works. He must have had a good destination because he was killed by Rama. Yeah. Something else? Yes.
So we don't have the version like Ramayana, like Bhagavad Gita as it is. We don't have other version. Or
We don't have a
it's not
Rama.
like,
We don't have a Ramayana as it is. No, there's no. Prabhupada didn't do a Ramayana. He wanted to do so many books. I don't know if he mentioned wanting to. I don't think he had a plan to do Ramayana specifically. He wanted to translate some of the Goswami's works, the 6 Goswamis. I think at one time he wanted to do the Vedanta Sutras. There's a list. I think in BBT have a list of what Prabhupada had once said he would like to do. Yeah. The Bhagavad Gita is, of course, a much shorter work than the Ramayana, and it's what is called a very stable text. What that means is there's practically no difference among all the different manuscripts and whatever of the Bhagavad Gita. Very tiny differences are there in just maybe a handful of verses. And the reason for that is that the Bhagavad Gita has received so much commentary by acharyas. So when someone writes a commentary, they'll quote the verse, or else part of the verse. So that makes it has a way of kind of fixing the text, so somebody can't change it. The Bhagavad Gita is like that. The Srimad Bhagavatam is also a quite stable text. There are little variations here and there throughout, but they're all quite minor. However, there is a bit of controversy with the Bhagavatam regarding 2 or 3 chapters. Some say, like in the Vallabha Sampradaya, they say that chapter 13 of Canto 10, which is the story of Brahma Vimohana Leela, Lord Brahma stealing the cows and the calves. I mean the calves and the cowherd boys. The Vallabhas say that can't be an authoritative chapter. It must have been interpolated. Why interpolated? Because Lord Brahma would never do such a thing. Because he is the founder of, he's the creator of the world, he is the great Lord Brahma, and so on. So they say like that. And there's one or two other chapters like that. But otherwise, the Bhagavatam is very stable. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are quite unstable. Means there are quite a variety of versions. And that's just the history. Someone decides, I'm going to copy the Ramayana. Because in the old days, if you wanted to have a copy, that meant you sit down and copy. And that's a big job. Or you hire someone to do it for you. And so in the process of copying, sometimes the person copying may not actually know very well Sanskrit. So they'll just be copying and then they'll not read clearly what it says. So they'll just write what they think it must say. Or someone who knows Sanskrit, they'll read this and they'll go, no, it can't be that. And they'll put something else. Another word, another phrase, sometimes a whole line, sometimes a whole verse. And then it goes from there. Someone decides, actually, this is missing the whole story of such and such, which I heard when I was a child. My grandmother told me. So that's got to be in there, and so they'll write that in. And as I mentioned a couple of days ago, I guess, there's sort of branches, and that's what, there's a certain species of scholar who they do what they call critical editions, and they'll bring lots of manuscripts together and they'll compare them. Super, super meticulous work. So with the Ramayana, there's what they call northern recension, southern recension, but there's also a northeast recension, northwest recension, all of which have variations. And Mahabharata is at least as variegated as the Ramayana. It's all over. So there is what's called the critical edition of the Ramayana, and there's a critical edition of the Mahabharata. I don't know how long the Ramayana took, but the critical edition of the Mahabharata took a group of several scholars 30 years to prepare. From sometime in the 1930s, I think they started. This was in India, in Pune, and they finished in 1960 something. We have a copy in our center in Oxford, several volumes. But then sometimes the scholars will look at the critical edition and they'll look at a passage and say, nah, that can't be right. In fact, he does this sometimes also. He says, I don't go with the critical edition. That can't be right. So a Ramayana as it is, well, good luck. What is the disciplic succession for the Ramayana? I don't know if there is exactly such a thing. But on the other side, I think we can be happy considering this is the age of Kali and, so much disturbance is there, so much is lost in terms of Vedic literature. Jiva Goswami says of the original Veda Samhitas, the 4 Rig, Sama, Yajur, Atharva, says of that literature, there remains available today only something like 5% of So we can be happy we have Ramayana in some forms, and we take, when there's something that we may feel is strange or hard to deal with, okay, we don't have to take that, we can let it be, and just draw from the text what inspires us and what gives us strength and enthusiasm in our devotion, in devotional service. Okay, so thank you all very much. Tomorrow we'll continue. I guess tomorrow morning we could continue with this episode, because this is where it gets very intense. Ravana's meeting Sita. It's also a very interesting passage. I was quite surprised. So yeah, I'll save that for tomorrow. Is that all right? Okay. Shri Shri Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman Ki Jai. Yes, I think tomorrow we have to also say something about Hanuman, right? Yeah. How can you talk about Ram Lila without Hanuman? Srila Prabhupada. Jai.